Hey, welcome everybody. Today's video we're going to be talking suspension, particularly in rear suspension. What I have just took purchase of is the Push Elevensix. Now this is the Micro XD model, so in other words it is their Gen 2 model. So a little backstory, I actually had the first Push a couple years back. I mounted it to my giant rain, and for whatever reason I had kind of a negative experience with it. Actually during a little race, the Rebound circuit went out, oil splattered everywhere, and long story short, I ended up sending it back and purchasing a air shock again. I purchased a Fox Float X2. Put that on the rain, thought it felt just fine, and ended up actually selling my first 11.6, which was the Gen 1 model. Fast forward a couple years, I was still on that same Float X2. I carried that over to my Hightower and over to my Hightower LT. And I just kind of got to thinking again, I wanted to try coil shock again. Stumbled upon this from a friend that actually happened to have one that didn't need it anymore, and so I gladly snagged it from them. So let's take a look at it. So obviously this is a coil shock. What makes the Push 11.6 unique is it has completely independent high speed and low speed compression circuits, meaning this compression circuit can be tuned independently from this one. So whereas a traditional shock will have like a switch, which basically just shuts either that one circuit completely off almost and makes it near rigid or close to rigid. You can actually set the second one to be, maybe you want it close to rigid, maybe you want it more pedal switch. So you can set them up independently from each other. Kind of makes it a little bit more tunable. And this is the Gen 2 Micro XD version, meaning they have this new coating that they put on the damper rod, shock body. It's supposed to be a little bit harder, a little bit slicker for even more small bump sensitivity. Now I have outfitted on mine my real world cycling needle bearing bushing out back, and actually an offset bushing up front to slacken the bike out a little bit more. Why go coil? So that's kind of the big debate right now. A lot of trail bikes and enduro bikes are kind of switching towards coil shocks. It's almost weird. It's almost downhillers are switching to air, and trail bikes or enduro bikes are switching over to coil. So I have, for example, my Float X2. This is excellent shock, probably one of the best air shocks you can buy. And I'm going to do a little comparison to the 11.6, which is arguably one of the best coil shocks you can buy. So back to the question, why would you go coil? So due to a coil's design, it has less seals than an air shock. And also the seals are smaller, meaning that the amount of friction is going to be less. It's going to allow this rod, which is kind of what your air shock stanchion would be, is a lot smaller. So it takes a lot less force to get that rod moving into the shock body. And then you have the coil spring as your, air or your preload. So small bump sensitivity is excellent on these. Also tunability in terms of it's kind of a set it and forget it type of thing. You don't have to worry about checking your air pressure. You don't have to worry about heat changing the inside of your shock characteristics. And there's generally going to be less heat buildup in one of these guys. Now, what are the drawbacks to a coil? For one, they're heavier. This is probably at least 300 grams, maybe close to a pound, 3/4 of a pound heavier than this similar Fox Float X2. Also, the tunability is going to be less. So factoring out your high and low speed compression and your rebound tuning, your spring is only going to come in certain increments. Now, Push teamed up with Hyperco to make springs that are in 25-pound increments, where most coils are 50. So you can really tune in a little bit better correct spring for your weight, and then from there you have this collar that you can kind of preload the spring or back it off to kind of fine tune it a little bit more. Whereas versus an air shock, you can literally, if you have a good digital gauge, you can tune this guy to the PSI. So again, this shock, in the air is your spring. It's got high and low speed compression, high and low speed rebound. And then another thing which is cool with air shocks is generally you can use what's called volume spacers. So this happens to be the Fox version. So you actually pull this sleeve up. This is your positive chamber, and you basically take these little spacers, you fill up that chamber. That changes the, I guess, progressivity, if that's a word, of the shock, meaning that the end stroke characteristics have changed, making it easier to bottom out or harder to bottom out. So those are kind of the negatives, I would say, of the coil shock. Now, what are the advantage of the air shock? Well, they're pretty much the exact opposite. Very lightweight, almost near infinite tunability if you go with a guy like this that has a lot of separate adjustments. And typically for most bikes, it'll help make a little linear feeling bike a little bit more progressive just by the way you can tune these guys. Why would you want to go with either? I mean, again, this is going to be down to personal preference. A lot of people are weight conscious, so they're going to shy away from coils just by feeling this guy's pretty heavy. So their mindset is it's a really heavy product. They don't want to add that weight to their bike. But to me, I got a quick ride on this. I have a race coming up this weekend that is going to be kind of the gauntlet throwdown of how this thing's going to do, and benefits far outweigh the negatives for me. It just really glues the rear tire to the ground to the point where you almost feel like you have a flat. You're always looking back there thinking you have a flat tire. What's unique about Push is they independently tune each shock for you as a person and for your bike. So this shock is personally tuned for my Hightower LT, for my weight, and for my riding preferences. So whereas a lot of people would say don't go with a coil on like a Hightower LT or really a lot of the old VPP Santa Cruz bikes, Push managed to make a coil shock that was small bump sensitive, but also very supportive in the mid-stroke. So kind of back to what we're seeing as a switch. Here's my thoughts on it. When this shock was brand new, this felt amazing. I've ridden it on a HD3, I've ridden it on a Trek Slash, and I've also ridden it on my personal bike. When this thing was new, I swear it was near frictionless. Like you could just kind of slowly tap down on the seat and the breakaway force was really almost non-existent. Now over time, it's still a great shock, but to maintain and get that back, you do have to send these in to kind of get them rebuild. Some of the bath oil in here is going to run dry. So you just kind of lose, I would say, probably 10 to 15% of overall performance as long as everything else is working as it should. And the coil shock, I'm willing to bet that this is going to retain its feeling for quite a bit of time. Probably for a lot longer than the X2 would, and probably the drop-off isn't going to be as drastic. Why you maybe see a lot of downhillers going to air shocks? Well, in my thought, they pretty much get their suspension rebuilt every race, almost maybe even every session. So they pretty much have a fresh, just absolutely great working shock every single time or day that they are running laps. The Enduro guys, I don't know if they get their suspension rebuilt every race. I imagine they would, but race distances are going to be a lot longer. We're about to do 25 miles of riding per day, whereas on a downhiller, per day, maybe 10, including practice and, your heat. So, so you're subjecting this to a lot more elements, wear, and it's just operating on a bike for a lot longer, I think, between service intervals compared to pro downhillers air shock. So that's just my thought. If I had the ability to have this X2 running fresh every single time I rode it, I probably would have kept it or kept on it. But that's just really not an option. So anyways, I just wanted to highlight the Push 11.6 coil shock. Again, this is the Micro XD Gen 2 version. I'm really looking forward to putting it through its paces this weekend. We have the North American Enduro Cup over at Kellogg, Idaho at Silver Mountain Bike Park. I'll be doing a lot of Instagramming, hopefully if I get enough service up there, kind of bringing you some coverage on how the race is going. So if you have any questions about this shock, the air shock, how they both rode on the Hightower, shoot me a comment, shoot me a direct message on Instagram. I'd be happy to answer all of them for you. And I'll be having more short-term, long-term impressions and follow-up on this guy. And then I plan on doing a full long-term review on this guy since I've had it for quite a while. So until next time, we'll see you guys later.